That's when the roving mic's going to be in action. Caleb up here in front. It's good to be with you. Let me ask you a question before I start. I do this lecture different ways, and sometimes just like on the spur of the moment. Make changes and make insertions. How many of you have seen my lecture on the resurrection where I walk off a timeline? Only a few of you. All right, good. Well, then that settles it. That's the one I'm asked for most frequently, and I think it makes the most sense because I think it's the most conducive to your learning how to give the evidence. And the evidence I'm going to share tonight is startlingly simple. It really, really is. You can take this lecture and you can do it in a Sunday school class of any age. I've done this, believe it or not, I've done this in a Christian school with the second and third graders. It's a little tough, but you can cover the main outlines. I just did it not terribly long ago in Oklahoma with a Christian high school group. So these were 8th to 12th graders, and that's easy to do it at that level. There's no big words, the concepts are easy, but they're profound in this sense. I'm going to be using data tonight. It's a method that I call the minimal facts method. I kind of worked on it back when I did my dissertation back in the Middle Ages at Michigan State University, 1976, so you know it really was the Middle Ages. And I developed this method where I argued that, let me say it this way, if the Bible is inspired, and in some sense God's word, Jesus has been raised from the dead. Makes sense. If the Bible is not inspired, but it's reliable, Jesus is still raised from the dead. What if the Bible is unreliable? What if it's unreliable, and what the skeptics, they come in different varieties, but what if skeptics like agnostics, atheists, other philosophical schools of thought who are generally dismissive of the supernatural, what if their view of the Bible is correct? Would you be surprised if I told you Jesus is still raised from the dead? On their Bible. Take their Bible, and Jesus is still raised from the dead. So, the resurrection of Jesus, in a sense, is a heads we win, tails you lose argument. You got it no matter what is true about the Bible. You say, well, I'm still thinking about what you said. And you said, on the skeptic's Bible. You mean Christopher Hitchens' Bible? Yeah. Dawkins' Bible? Yeah. Better known skeptics, better known scholars than them. For example, Anthony Flew, that Dr. Foreman mentioned earlier. We debated on the resurrection 3 times. All 3 of them, he was an atheist. He became a theist before he died, and only the Lord knows if he went any further than that. But he did become a theist. But the last time we debated, I should tell you, not only is he the best known philosophical atheist in the world, he was a specialist on the miracles issue. And he was against it. He doesn't think any supernatural things happen. And yet, when we started our last debate, we started by just trying to get some common ground. They put a list of 12 facts up on the board that actually come from this book. 12 facts on the board, and he allowed all of them to be admitted as data. In other words, he didn't really have any problem with them. And in that last debate, I stuck with those facts and argued that we couldn't know the resurrection happened on his atheistic sense of whatever he thought was true about Scripture. That's the argument I'm going to use tonight. And I'm going to use another argument here at the beginning. I'm going to say a few things about the Gospels. That is not, you can make it according to this argument. But when I get to the part on Paul, in just a few minutes, from that point on, I'm using the critics' data. I'm using data they would allow. So, when I go to a university campus, they advertise, much like they have here, that I'm speaking on the resurrection. And so you don't think I'm doing a bait and switch if I begin talking about the gospel. Why? Because because that's how Paul starts in the best known chapter on the resurrection in the Bible. So I was direct their attention to 1 Corinthians 15. You don't see very many, Bibles, pages of the Bible rustling at state university campuses or private schools. I've been at Princeton and Purdue in the last little while, and other campuses. But they listen, and I'll say, hey, here's how Paul starts that chapter, often called the resurrection chapter, 58 verses. Paul starts like this. He says, when I came to Corinth, I gave you Corinthians the gospel. Now I'm paraphrasing Paul, but basically what Paul goes on to say, first two verses, what you do with the words I spoke, basically what you do with Jesus, determines where you spend eternity. He said, I preached the gospel to you, and if you received it, you're a Christian, and if not, you're not. Now, that's a pretty simple, straightforward beginning, because whenever the gospel, defined narrowly, it's defined both broadly and narrowly in the Gospels. In fact, the Gospels themselves are Gospels, but this is the gospel message within the Gospels. Whenever the gospel data are defined, and this comes chiefly in the writings of Paul and the book of Acts, whenever the gospel is defined, so if somebody asks you the question, according to you Christians, what is your gospel? What must a person do to be saved? Just curious. Well, whenever it's defined in the New Testament, sometimes other things are thrown in there, but these three facts are always present. The deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. Deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. You say, well, I don't see the word deity on these various passages. That's because I use deity as sort of a generic term that encompasses a number of things, but most obviously certain names for Jesus, certain titles would be more appropriate. He's the Lord. He's Son of God. He's Son of Man. And by the way, sometimes you hear it said, Son of God is Jesus' divine nature, Son of Man is his human nature. Not true. In fact, many people think Son of Man is as lofty a title as Son of God is. Son of Man may even be a higher title in Jewish thought. So, Jesus is the Son of God, died on the cross for us, was raised bodily from the dead. That's the gospel. Paul says, what are you going to do with it? So 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3, Paul starts out like this. He says, I gave you what I was given. I delivered unto you that which I also received, as of first importance. How that Christ, notice the title, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and was raised again the third day, and appeared. And then a list of appearances comes. Paul adds his own appearance to the end, and you end up with 3 appearances to individuals, Paul, James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, and 3 appearances to groups, a group called the 12, a group called all the apostles, and a group of 500 at once, but it says 500 brethren. This could be a male head count only, like when Jesus fed 5,000, it says 5,000 males. If that's the case here, if you count women and children, Jesus could have appeared to 1,000 people on this occasion. So, the 12, all the apostles, and a very large group of 500 or more. And Paul said this comes from very early material. Okay, so I'm going to map out some territory here, and then I'm going to show you a little different. I'm going to give you 2 arguments tonight. The first one's not quite as tight because the data I'm going to use are going to be a little broader. And you can argue it with anybody. In fact, most apologists use this argument, the other one. The one that I call minimal facts. It's starting to come in. If you look on websites, this is becoming the most popular way to argue for the resurrection today. But I'm going to do both with you, so we can be practical here and give you a couple ways to get there. All right, I'm going to start like this. Let me walk down here, and let me call this ground zero, okay? That's creation down there. 2012 down there. This is ground zero. This is the date of Jesus' death. Most scholars say 30 AD. Next most popular date, 33. So, it's hard to know for sure. It's hard to be dogmatic. So that's why I call this ground zero. I'm interested in how many years there are from and to this event. Because when you're doing historiography, when you're studying history, secular, religious, principles are the same. When you do historiography, you want as early sources as possible, and you want eyewitness sources if possible, but very little history in the ancient world is established by eyewitness testimony. Very little. And yet it's an important rule that the scholars are looking for. They just know they don't have it very often. So we go to and from this point. Now if you ask the average person, average Christian, let's say, how would you evidence these events right here? What's the best way to get there? And at least up until recently, the most popular approach has been to do something like this. Well, I'd start with the Gospel of Mark. Now, I'm going to use critics' dates, all right? Because the critics' dates are not that much later than evangelical dates. And you'll be able to see that even by using their dates, that will not upset our argument at all. So I do this for them. Now, the whole minimal facts argument is an attempt to allow their data, not because they're right, but to use their data to show them that even on their data, the most important event in history can be established. That's the point, is to take their case, so that you don't spend all day arguing about whose case is better. You'd say, we can prove the case with your facts. So, their data. Mark is going to be dated about plus 40 after the death of Jesus. So 30 plus 40, about 70 AD. Could be 65, could be 75, according to the critics, but about plus 40. They're going to date Matthew at about plus 80, Luke at about plus 85. Evangelicals put these books in the 60s, so they're about 20 years later, but it changes nothing. So Luke at about 65, that's the 65, 55. 55 and 30, 85. And everybody puts John at about 95 or plus 65. Are you all with me? Mark at about plus 40. Matthew at about plus 50 or 80 AD. Luke at about 55 or plus 85. John, the latest, 65, which is 65 plus 30, 95 AD. And a lot of times critics will say, these books are just too late to make a difference. And when you hear that, just, if you're dialoguing with them, just smile real big. Let them know they're not bothering you at all, but you really question what they're saying. This stuff's too late to make a difference. I had a big debate in April with one of the new atheists, Michael Shermer. He's the editor of Skeptic Magazine, and, an ex-evangelical. And we were debating, and he got to pick two extra guys. See, we were the main debaters all day on Friday. Then Saturday, we each brought two more people in, so there were 6 of us dialogue the next day. And he got to bring 2 fellows in. And one of the fellows he brought in was another well-known new atheist. His name is Victor Stenger. He's a physicist, and he's written some. He's pretty rough on Christians. Let's put it that way. And Michael and I had debated the night before. The topic was, is there an afterlife? A little different topic, but the resurrection did come up. And the next day, Vic and I were up on the stage. He just got done giving a lecture, and he said, the Gospels are way too late to make a difference. Are you kidding me? 65 years later? Well, why can't we talk about 40 years later? Why take the latest one? But, no difference. 65 years later, it's garbage. And he gave a bunch of facts, and I don't know a word students in the crowd were saying, something, this list of things are off Wikipedia or something. And I got up there, and I said, okay, let me ask you a question, because we were dialoguing. I said, let me ask you a question. Do you think we know a lot about Alexander the Great? And he said, yeah, a lot about Alexander the Great. I mean, think about some of the things we know. 33 years old when he dies, he took over the world, fastest time ever, most disciplined army ever to come about. He marches east from Macedonia, north of Greece, all the way over to India, takes over the known world with, like I said, the most disciplined forces there are, dies of a fever, and four of his generals divided up his empire. Yeah, we know a fair amount about him. When did we get that data about Alexander? Ancient history, I guess. Okay. 5 contemporaries wrote about Alexander. 5. None of their works exist today. You can't read any of them. The earliest source for Alexander, if ground zero down there is Alexander's death, about 330 BC. 300 years later, you're going to be getting all the way down here, different timeline, but you're going to get all the way down here to when the new, the time of Christ begins. 300 years. And that's our first source. Our best sources for Alexander, Plutarch and Arrian. And if that's ground zero down there, with a shorter, we'll see, this is a shorter leash here than it is for the New Testament. Because we're already 300 years after Alexander right there. The latest gospel, 65. The 2 most popular sources for Alexander $425 to $450 later. 4 1/4 to $450 later. And I said, do we know a lot about Alexander? Yeah. Really? From 300 to 450 years later. Well, yeah, but the Gospels aren't trustworthy because there's miracles in the Gospel. Really? Do you know how Plutarch's Alexander starts? It is said that Alexander was born of a virgin, and I think his dad was the son of Jupiter, something like that, or he was. I have to go back and look at Plutarch. Isn't that a little loftier than, well, you guys have a virgin birth? Yeah, you eliminated all the sources. You said they were too late. And you're going to use a source from 450 and throw ours out from plus 40 to plus 65. Here's another one. The Caesar who's on the throne when Jesus lived. So I can go back down here. The Caesar is named Tiberius. He dies just a few years after Jesus. So they overlap very nicely. We have 4 major sources for Tiberius. Pretty good. 4 Gospels. All right, let's go head to head. The earliest source for Tiberius is contemporary. Beat that. You know Mark's plus 40. Maybe you want to go with the evangelical date and argue plus 30 or 32 or something like that. But his is contemporary. But this is the worst of the 4 sources for Tiberius. This is the worst one. The next best source for Tiberius is the best one. It's the best. We're back on the New Testament timeline now. And the best source for Tiberius Tacitus, about 118 AD, or plus 80. The next one, Suetonius, 5 years later, plus 85. And the 4th source, Dio Cassius, I have to walk out there and go through that wall and keep going, because Dio Cassius is plus 180. 4 best sources for Tiberius. 5. Our worst is John plus 65 if you're only comparing time differences. How about total sources? There are about 10 sources for Tiberius. There are a lot more than that for Jesus. In fact, we have about 12 non-Christian sources for Jesus alone. So just on common grounds here, to do history the way you do history, we have an excellent starting point with Jesus. Excellent starting point. So this is one way you can go after it. I call this method the reliability method, because you want to argue that the Gospels are in the right place at the right time to present reliable records. That's the way, up until the last 10 years, most apologists have argued. And you can still bring this argument about. All right, starting now, I'm going to use the minimal facts argument, and I'm using only critically accepted material. I'm not going to start with Mark at about 70 AD. I'm going to go to an earlier source. Virtually every New Testament critic today, I don't care how conservative he is, I don't care how liberal he is, I don't care how much he believes. Virtually every critic today will tell you the best New Testament witness is Paul. Paul's the critic's darling. Why is that? Well, here's the way the critic's going to say it. We don't know who wrote the 4 Gospels. Now, some of you, that gives you something to work on. Get your master's degree, work on your PhD, work on the authorship. The Gospels are starting to come back as good sources. Now, hold on to the story behind that. But most critics will say, they're anonymous books, we don't know who the authors are, we do know who Paul is, and that's a huge head start. But we also know that Paul is a scholar. He's a scholar. Anthony Flew in his atheist days, Anthony Flew said, there's no question that the Apostle Paul was a first-class philosophical mind. He said, just read the book of Romans. Watch how he carries out an argument. A first-class philosophical mind, the Apostle Paul. So we know who he is. We know he's brilliant. Book of Acts says he studied under the main scholar at that time, Gamaliel. Some of them allow that, some of them aren't crazy about that. Depends on who the skeptic is. Paul's a scholar, just read his works. And there's 13 books that bear Paul's name in the New Testament. These guys will give you 7 or 8 of them. 7 or 8. They'll grant them. They will allow you to use those sources as authoritative. What's authoritative mean? Inspired? No. Everything he says is true? No. But everything he says is stated truthfully. And he's a good scholar. He's the only witness we have, a lot of critics say, the only witness we have of a resurrection appearance of Jesus. They'll tell you that. Michael Martin, atheist philosopher, the only eyewitness of a resurrection appearance whose testimony we have is the Apostle Paul. Also, he knew many of the other apostles, so he could get first-hand information from them. How good is that? He knew the others. So, Paul's the guy. Now, what books are they going to give you? What's 6 to 8? If you're writing sermons, and that's a little different field than historicity and so on, but if you're writing a sermon, they're going to give you the books you will almost always ask for, because they're going to give you the major ones. You may use the following in your research. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, Philemon. Sometimes they throw Colossians in. And they're going to give you those books. Once again, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, the first 4 Pauline books of the New Testament. Skip Ephesians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philippians, and Philemon. Now, you have this age-old question when the church is going liberal or your friend's kind of slipping. You can either say, no, I'm not going to talk to you unless you give me all 13 of Paul's epistles. Or you can say, you're going to give me 6, 7, 8? You will? Oh, well, I'll take those and run. And that's the way the minimal facts argument argues. it says, I'm going to take the critics' data. Now, it's more than just saying I'm going to take these 6, 7 books of Paul and use them. I'm going to use individual data that I won't be able to explain tonight, except to say it's each of these facts is viewed as a fact because it can be established according to the critics. It can be established by their historiography, their historical method, which is a little different than ours. They're going to come up with a list of facts. And you can find them on my website, by the way, GaryHabermas.com. So, I'm going to use Paul's epistles and some of these facts. In fact, I'm going to basically use nothing except from 2 chapters of these accredited books of Paul. I'm going to use only 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And the end of Galatians 1, beginning of Galatians 2, which there are no chapter divisions in these original books, so that's one text. End of Galatians 1, beginning of Galatians 2, that text, 1 Corinthians 15, mostly just the first few verses. All right, now Paul says in verse 3, let's go back there. Paul says, I gave you what I was given. And many times I say, do you get how great this is? I gave you what I was given. And you might say, all right, professors move a little more quickly than that. I think I can handle that. No, listen. I gave you what I was given. All right. Okay. Someone taught Paul, and he's teaching us. But what he's telling you is something about his historiography. It's sort of like Luke 1, 1-4, where Luke says, I've been reading the eyewitnesses, I acknowledge these things from the beginning, and I'm telling you the truth about Jesus. That's sort of like what Paul's doing. Paul says, I'm getting this from the horse's mouth, so to speak. I'm going to the people in charge. How do you know? Well, that's what we're going to work out right here. So when does Paul say this? 1 Corinthians 15. Everybody dates 1 Corinthians 15 in the mid-50s AD. Let's just say 55. Someone might say, well, I'll give you 53. Somebody else might say 57. But 55 is a nice average. Pauline authorship. Now, verses 1 and 2, Paul said, when I came to Corinth, this is the gospel I gave you. We already mentioned that. When I came to Corinth, you're already only 25 years from ground zero, right here. 30, 55. 25 years. He said, this is the same message that I gave you when I went to Corinth. When did you come to Corinth? 51 AD. In fact, some New Testament scholars say this is the most readily identifiable date in the New Testament. Because we have the name of the city official. We learn who he is when Paul comes to town. And a stone slab has been found with his name on it. And these officials were only in charge of things for 1 year at a time. And this guy was there 51 to 52 AD. Paul could have been there as late as 52, as early as 51, but that's when he preached this message. We're now 21 and a half years from ground zero. The most exciting thing is to ask this question. Paul said, I gave you what I received. I gave you what I was given. Where and from whom did Paul receive this material? Now, I dragged this out. There's a lengthy argument here, but let me just give you the critics' conclusion. This is not an evangelicals buy it, but it was critics who came up with this argument. Critics believe that Paul received this material about +5 or 35 AD. You see, well, I think Jesus died in 33 AD. Great. 38 AD. You see, the +5 stays the same. About 5 years after the cross, Paul got this material. Come on. How can you be that specific? Because remember, Paul is authoritative. He's intelligent. He's well trained. He knows languages. He's honest. He's the only person we know, if you want to be strict like the critics, who's an eyewitness to the resurrection appearance of Jesus. And he does the math for you. He's not going to lie to you. That's the critics think. He's not going to lie. Here's the cross. When did Paul come to the Lord? When did the trip to Damascus take place? Another way to ask that. How many years is Acts 9 after Acts 1? And most critics think that Paul was converted about +2, maybe +3 after the cross. If you say +2, then in Galatians chapter 1, he says, I didn't go running up to Jerusalem right away to see those who were apostles before me. I waited for 3 years. And then after 3 years, I went to Jerusalem. Okay, go with me? Conversion, +3. He's in Jerusalem with +5. You say, well, I think he was converted 3 years later. That's great. 3 years later, and 3 to Jerusalem. Now we're all the way up to 6 years after. So Paul's there, and in Galatians chapter 1, here's what we read. Paul said, I didn't do anything. For 3 years I went out and preached, and I didn't go to Jerusalem. But then I did. And I came to Jerusalem, and I spent 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of the Lord. 15 days. Recently, Bart Ehrman. How many of you know who Bart Ehrman is? Okay. A few of you. He's probably the best-known skeptic in America today. He defines himself, he identifies himself as an agnostic leaning toward atheism. And he's a New Testament specialist. Very good Greek scholar. And Bart Ehrman says, it's really a cool line. He said, Paul spent 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of the Lord. He said, I'd like to spend 15 days with James and Peter. That'd be cool. And then Bart Ehrman says this, except for Paul, he says, where can you get any closer to eyewitness testimony than this? Okay, see the backdoor argument here? Bart's not going to let you get away with Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, but he will let you talk to him about Paul, and especially Paul's talk back here with Peter and James. He'll let you do that, because he knows who these guys are. They're eyewitnesses of Jesus, and except for Paul, eyewitnesses of a good chunk of his life, besides just the resurrection. Now, what do you think they talked about for 15 days? I think a lot of things, but if I were Paul, this would have been my first question. I'll tell you what Jesus looked like on the road to Damascus if you tell me what he looked like after the cross. You tell me one more important question than that. I'm sure Paul wanted to hear from their mouth what the resurrection was like for them. Because Paul says, I come to preach nothing but Christ and him crucified. Paul speaks way more. It's got what the historical Jesus? Paul talks way more about the death and resurrection of Jesus than probably all the rest of Jesus' life put together. And what's Galatians about? It's a short book. Well, what's the theme of Galatians? It's the gospel. Get it right. Don't add to it. Don't subtract from it. Don't blow it. This is God's word. You ready? All right. Learn it. Pass it on. That's Galatians. So how could he have been there for 15 days, majoring in the gospel, spending most of his time when he talks about Jesus, talking about the gospel message, and not have asked him about the gospel? Even Bart Ehrman says it's obvious they discussed the gospel data. All right, now watch this. This happens at +5 or +6. There's a Greek word in Galatians 1:18. That's a very valuable word, very good word. I'll tell you what, I'll put it over here. Well, the whole word, it's hysteresai. But here's the root word, and I'm transliterating historicity. It's the Greek word from which we get our word history. And this is what Paul uses to tell you what he was doing in Galatians 1:18. Oftentimes, English translations slaughter this term. It says things like, he saw Peter. A little better, he inquired of Peter. It's a little better. I know of 2 or 3 non-evangelical word studies. And here's the conclusion. It's not fair to say back in the 1st century that there's our word history, he was playing the historian, that settles it. Because we don't know if the word's always meant the same. But in papyri, at that early date, histor is used, I guess today, the closest we would say. You probably see it on your television every night, depending on what area of the country you're from, at 10 or 11 o'clock. It's called Eyewitness News. Historicity means to check something out firsthand. Well, let's put this together. Paul comes to Jerusalem, +5 or +6. He's interviewing James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. He's he's investigating something, he's interviewing them, and the whole book of Galatians is about the gospel. What do you think they're talking about? Paul wanted to be a little bit pushy. Here's a pastoral, this is an informational footnote in my little lecture. If Paul were going to make a pastoral application, he might do this. With a group this size, there are a lot of people in this room, I dare say, many of us, maybe the majority, who have not been all that we could have been for the Lord, either before our salvation or after. And maybe some of us had some major slip-ups, and we're not proud of it. What if Paul started the conversation like this? Not to bug you guys, but I have a question. You guys know I was a persecutor. I thought I was doing God a favor to imprison and kill men, women, and even children for the name of Jehovah. And I was wrong. But with all due respect, you guys have some blood on your hands too. James, most of your life, you did not believe your own brother. And if I remember the account correctly, when Jesus came to town, you and your brothers tried to lock him up. You thought he was nuts. That is the way the Greek reads in Mark 3. And Peter, he denied your Lord 3 times. And he went to the cross. I mean, I'm just saying. If you had spoken up in his favor, who knows what would have happened? I'm sure Paul believes that was God's choice and that was decreed to be that way. But still, Peter denied the Lord. There's a message here that these 3 great founders of the church all came from very questionable pasts to revolutionize the world. That's a neat message. So they're all together here. Paul's interviewing them, presumably talking about the gospel. And then Galatians 2 starts. Galatians 2 starts this way. Galatians 2:2 is one of the most incredible verses in the whole New Testament. Paul says, 14 years later I went back up to Jerusalem. Okay, 14 years. Critics put this at about 48 AD, 4 plus 18. They go back up to Jerusalem in 2:2. Galatians 2:2. I like the King James here, but translations are almost the same. Paul said, I went up there to see the pillars, the apostles. I set before them the gospel I was preaching to see if I was running or had run in vain. What? Yeah, about 48 AD, I set the gospel before them to make sure we were all on the same page. Paul, you waited 18 years to see if you and the boys were on the same page? I think Paul would say, you're not really paying attention to my argument, are you? Okay, I'm going to stop there. I usually do this little bombastic kind of ending, and I'm gonna leave that off for right now. But what I'm saying is we can get back in time. Someone might say, well, what about the naturalistic theories? What if you could make something up and say, this is all well and good, but Jesus didn't really rise to the dead. What really happened was fill in the blank. I'll tell you what, take the mic and propose whatever one you want, and we'll discuss it. Because what I'm going to suggest is the same facts that tell you we got it early and from eyewitnesses are able to refute any other alternative you come up with. In fact, today, what if I told you most critics do not come up with alternative theories? Most critics don't come up with alternative theories. In fact, I was debating a guy once, and he was an atheist on campus. He was a Christian debater. He was a Christian hater. In fact, I was there when he challenged this football player. The guy said like one positive thing about Christianity. Who knows if he was a Christian? But the professor was a little guy, and he got so mad that this big football player made a comment. He challenged the kid to a fight in the class. He was not very happy with Christians. The big guy should have just said, "Come on outside," but he had to get a grade from the guy. So, all right, well, I debated this guy, and when we debated, he said to me, "Oh, the doors on this college." The doors. It said no smoking, no smoking, no smoking, no smoking over every door. And he got in there, took his pipe out, lit it up. Pipe in his mouth. You know, people talk with a pipe in their mouth. And he said, so we got into this thing, and I started explaining this, and he goes, Habermas, you're starting to get me in a corner, and I don't like it. I said, why don't you just pick a naturalistic theory? Why don't you just tell me what you think happened if it's not the supernatural? Not going to do it. Why not? Because then you're going to paint me into a corner and I'm not going to look too good. I said, but isn't that your view? You're a naturalist. All naturalists paint themselves into corners, right? And then he said this. As far as I'm concerned, this debate is over. And he wouldn't talk anymore. He wouldn't talk. Now, his field was not philosophy or religion. He was an English literature professor. In other words, you can guess how postmodern he was and everything else. But he just thought there were no such thing as facts, and he tried that, and it didn't work. And he didn't want to go any further. He didn't want to make up a theory because he didn't want to get cooked. And he quit talking. He quit talking. We're done. We're done talking. It's probably my first debate. I have to go back and think about that. It's probably the first debate I ever had. And he's done. So, pardon? If someone doesn't answer your questions, you win a debate. Right? They've got to answer your questions, just like you have to answer theirs.